Hey there, and welcome back to the Empowered Nutrition Podcast. It's the highlight of my day. I've been really looking forward to this. I'm so happy to welcome you, Teri Patterson, to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh my gosh, thanks for coming. This is such an important topic that maybe I'll just get real honest up front. I don't think I would have been totally ready for this topic. I've been struggling with this topic of alcohol for a long time. And so when I read your story, it really resonated with me in the sense of like you were coming into the health space as a health expert, but then you were having a hard time reconciling that with your slowly creeping up alcohol habits. And that's exactly been my experience where I've had a harder and harder time reconciling those two things. And actually, I always do dry January and I make it through just fine. But then February 1st, I'm like, okay, great, back to drinking wine. That was that was a long month. Like back we go. But this month I've been doing the alcohol experiment. I'm on day 26. And I've watched every single video, and it's been life changing because it works. I mean, I know the goal of the alcohol experiment is to not judge you based off whether you drink alcohol or not. The goal is to offer you the opportunity to learn more about alcohol so that you can hopefully change the way you feel and your desire for alcohol. And I can tell you, it's been really miraculous. I kind of look at it and I'm kind of grossed out now. So it's a
Wow.
good thing. Yeah. But maybe you could just kind of orient us to a little bit about your story in terms of alcohol and especially how it's played with your work in the health space.
Yes. Well, first of all, I applaud you for, challenging
Thanks.
yourself for the dry January. And it really is important, what you say there, Erin, because it's a lot like nutrition. Like if we go in with these preconceived ideas and we have a black or white sort of goal and outcome, sometimes that doesn't serve us as well as just exploring, do I feel better when I'm not drinking? And
Yeah.
that really is a great place to start, is just say, gosh, is alcohol really serving me? And that's kind of where I started. So my story, I was kind of just a normal drinker. I drank all the usual things.
Yeah.
And, eventually, because we'll talk about kind of the health impacts, but alcohol does build a tolerance. And so, I found myself drinking more to get the same effect.
Mhm.
And then I found that I was using alcohol for a lot more than just social occasions.
Mhm.
Started using alcohol to relax, started using alcohol as a reward, started using alcohol when I was bored. And so my personal journey, I was always kind of considered myself a wellness enthusiast. So I wasn't actually a nutritionist
Mhm.
until I stopped drinking. So what happened for me is when I finally said, this whole moderation game
Mhm.
is messing with my head and taking a lot more energy.
Yeah.
What if I just stop? And so I gave myself permission to not drink. And that immediately freed up a lot of space in my head so that I could focus on the how. And what happened next was, like you've probably noticed in this month, we have a lot
Mhm.
more time and energy when we're not
Mhm. Mhm.
checking out at night. And,
Mhm.
so I had all of this time and energy. And in fact, my husband was like, you got to do something.
With
And
this.
yeah, it was a lot. And it was good, but it was also like, uh-oh, every evening just there's hours to, fill. And so that's when I explored going to nutrition school. And it kind of
Mhm.
came up organically. I saw an article on the front page of my little paper and I thought, what is this woman doing? And I checked with her and we had coffee and I ended up enrolling in the Nutritional Therapy Association. And when I was in that container, what was so interesting is that I thought, well, now I've met my people. They're not going to be drinking. Like they're all woke. They've got it figured out that alcohol
Yeah.
is not healthy. And
Yeah.
that
No.
wasn't, no, and that wasn't the case at all. And so that was kind of my first aha. But I noticed as I received my certification and started coaching people in the health space that a lot of the issues were impacted by people drinking. And when I suggested they take a look at their drinking or cut back, they really didn't, they had so much trouble. That was more difficult in many cases than doing dietary changes.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I don't really have the tools. And so I stumbled upon the work, kind of, the universe delivered, I should say, the work of Annie Grace and This Naked Mind. And she is the author of The Alcohol Experiment.
Yeah.
And so I connected with her, and I did the alcohol experiment back in 2018, not because I was drinking. I actually stopped drinking in 2015, but I wanted to see what it was all about. And I thought, this is what I could have used. This would have really helped. The science behind it, the nuances, the brain, the story I was telling myself. And so I was able to become one of the first This Naked Mind certified coaches. And so I've been working with clients in this alcohol-free space since 2019. So it's really interesting because often people come from their own health journey into becoming a nutritionist, for example. And for me, I didn't really have a health journey other than alcohol. So, now it's kind of come full circle for me.
Yeah.
And it's really been beautiful to work in this space.
Yeah, I totally resonated with what you said about if I think the classic way our culture looks at sobriety or even drinking less alcohol is that you just have to white knuckle it through that. And there's nothing to do but have like superhuman self-control. And it's a lot like that with food. In fact, like there's things that we've talked, like a part of my practice is changing your metabolic health so that you have less cravings and less appetite and address more of your challenges around weight that way, instead of just white knuckling it through not eating even when you're hungry. And I see this as the same way. It's like if say we're in an appointment, in a nutrition appointment, we say, hey, I think let's think about your alcohol intake. It's terrifying. I think that because they don't know of any other way they don't know of a way to have less desire for alcohol. And I like one thing that Annie says a lot of, like, you're falsely led to believe that like alcohol is like the glue that's holding your life together, when actually it's like a part of like what's not serving your life well, on a different level for different people. But maybe you can talk a little bit more about that in terms of like how do you, with the alcohol experiment, like talk about maybe some of the ways that you achieve that with people, of like actually helping them to have like less desire for alcohol?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because I like to say, and I think this helps set it up, behavior comes last. So, we can white knuckle our way through taking a 30-day break. But like you said, then on day 31 or the next month, we're like, whoo, done. I barely made it. It was so challenging. Like, but that's not lasting change. And so if we think about behavior coming last, we start with our thoughts and emotions around drinking. So it's really powerful I always like to have my clients set an intention. First of all, we really look at, what are the reasons that I want to change? Where is alcohol showing up in my life? Where is it entangled in everything that I do? And that might look different from someone who is a primarily social or binge drinker who goes out to bars versus me. I was just drinking at home, pouring that glass of wine and then pouring another glass of wine and then more wine. And, so those can look very different. And so it's really powerful to start with what our intention is around alcohol, because we can set a goal, but then an intention allows us to be very much more open-ended. And so it can look like, an intention might look like, I want to reduce the impact alcohol is having on my body. I want to notice where it's showing up in my life. I want to see if I can develop new activities that help me cope with those things I'm using alcohol for. So we need to get really specific about our thoughts around alcohol, because culture tells us that alcohol helps us relax, it helps us celebrate. And we get to ask, is that really true? And when we talk about or think about the actual health impacts of alcohol actually increases our cortisol and adrenaline. And so we actually are not more relaxed. But because alcohol is both a stimulant and a depressant, in the beginning, we might say, oh, I'm feeling more relaxed, but eventually the chemicals that are released from alcohol create more anxiety. And so it's really powerful to explore what I think I know and what is actually true. So those are a couple of ways to kind of start with understanding the impact of alcohol and the role that alcohol is playing in our life and untangling some of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I love the way that, by the way, if anybody doesn't know about this, the alcohol experiment is free.
Yes.
It's an app that you can download. I think it's the Naked Mind app. Is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
It has this free 30-day alcohol experiment. The videos are very digestible, maybe 15 to 20 minutes per day, around that. And then, and it challenges and educates our thinking around alcohol, but it's never that you are expected to not drink alcohol. It's more just, I love what you alluded to, of like the idea that small alcohol can become like small and unimportant in our life. So, hey, you have a glass of wine once in a while, no big deal. But that glass of wine didn't feel like you had to have it and you were obsessed and like fixated on it. It was just like, hey, it was like a casual glass of wine that like I could have taken it or left it. And I resonated with your story when I was reading it, because I've had the same thing where, hey, I've never been like where I've got like legal trouble over my alcohol use or anything like that. But it's just been slowly more where it's like, I'm not sure if I actually can stop drinking. And then I try to moderate better and I fail. So it starts to feel like out of control. And so I like how in the alcohol experiment, you talk about like the addictive properties of alcohol. Like, don't be surprised when you're drinking something that's addictive and you feel addicted to it, basically.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the brain chemistry there of how that works.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's really interesting because alcohol is one of the few things that we blame the person rather than taking a closer look at this addictive substance.
Yeah.
So if somebody becomes addicted to heroin, we don't say like, well, there's nothing wrong with heroin. You are bad. You are a loser. Like, you just can't control your heroin use. No, we don't say that because we recognize that it's an addictive substance. But it's so fascinating when it comes to alcohol because we say alcohol and other drugs. So we don't even identify that alcohol also is a carcinogen. It is a drug. It is addictive. So it's really powerful to start there because it's important to not put the blame on ourselves. We like to say, in this Naked Mind methodology, we like to say, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. So anyone who drinks enough alcohol over time can become addicted because it is addictive to humans. However, not everybody's going to fall into that same place. And depending upon what you use alcohol for, that can look different. But when we think about our brain, so we have dopamine, which is this wanting molecule, this neurotransmitter that is released when we use something that brings us a lot of pleasure, when we introduce something that brings us a lot of pleasure. So your listeners might be familiar with it in sugar, right? So we can get this heightened dopamine rush when we have something super sweet, and we get that. Our brain says, "Oh, that's good. Do more of that." So it's that wanting. So the same thing happens with alcohol. And so we get this huge rush of dopamine. And what's really interesting about alcohol, one of the ways that alcohol works is when we are constantly flooding our brain with excess dopamine, our body is really smart and resourceful. So it turns down those dopamine receptors. So we actually have less dopamine available for simple pleasures like joy, watching a child laugh, watching the sunset, hugging our partner. And so pretty soon it starts to feel like only alcohol brings us that enhanced pleasure. And it's true. That's the way the chemical is designed to work. And so we're seeing that we have this heightened pleasure. And then the other way that it works is we get this initial buzz, but as it starts to drop off, as our blood alcohol content drops, that's when we start wanting that dopamine. We want to get back to where we felt that pleasure, that intense rush before. And so we want that next drink. And it's why it's very hard for people to have one drink. People often say to me in the programs that I coach in and my individuals that I coach with, it'd be great if I could just have one glass of wine.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's not designed to work that way. That's the addictive part of it. And we do build a tolerance. And it's really interesting because when we drink alcohol and then our blood alcohol content drops, we have that next drink, but we never get as much pleasure as we did with the first drink. So we're always kind of chasing the bottom. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one way that alcohol can really have an impact. And then we're questioning our own, like, what is wrong with me that I can't drink like other people? Why can't I moderate? Well, you are entangled with this addictive substance, and the brain is telling you what the brain is telling you based on that ingestion of that substance.
Totally. I mean, entanglement is such a good word for it. I mean, you would think like with most things, the longer you do it, the better you get at it. But shoot, I started drinking. I probably shouldn't even say how old I was that I started drinking. So I've been drinking 25 years and I'm getting worse and worse at it. I feel
Mm.
like um, that creep keeps happening where it's like you feel like you have a harder and harder time moderating. And that, I think, to me underscores the brain chemistry that's happening here in terms of the entanglement that you described with addiction. And I like how you brought up how, just to kind of like reinforce this, alcohol is going to stimulate a cortisol increase, and then your body is going to then in turn respond by releasing, and like this opioid hit response that you get from alcohol is going to result in this release of this thing called dimorphin, which is like this depressant, like opposite of opioid substance in your brain. And that dimorphin is going to blunt the opioid response that you have to further alcoholic drinks that in sequence. And so you're going to have where you're less and less responsive. So you keep chasing it, but you don't quite hit that same level of satisfaction from it. And then at the same time, that dimorphin over time, if you're chronically drinking, is kind of perpetually um, more active and released. And so you have this kind of blunted effect on like your joy in general in response to just everyday things like going to the playground with your kids or something. I felt that lately where it's kind of like maybe it's been like, I was like thinking about it during the alcohol experiment. So maybe like 7 years that I've kind of really started to do what you were talking about on something I listened to, where it's like, you really start to think, I'd like to do this less, but I can't
Mhm.
really figure out how. And I have noticed over those 7 years, it's like, wow, I just feel a little bit more flat over
Yes.
time. And that's what that does. But
Yes.
you don't really totally realize it until you stop. And so it's so fascinating to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the other really interesting thing about the dynorphin and the adrenaline and the cortisol is super fascinating is, and I think a lot of people can relate to this very simple idea that many people have something called hangxiety. And I remember when I first heard the term, I was already alcohol free because my hangovers, Erin, looked like vomiting and room spinning and dehydration and feeling like crap and having a headache and low energy and, oh, I need to go back to bed and, oh, I still feel bad. But many, many people get a heightened anxiety in the morning. And
Mm.
that is this exact effect that we're talking about, is that because alcohol is both a depressant and a stimulant. We get that initial stimulation and then we get that depressive part. And then in order to counterbalance all that, we've got this cortisol and this adrenaline, and that heightened anxiety
Mm.
shows up often for people in that morning after. So if you've ever experienced more anxiety with drinking, this is because alcohol is just designed, that's the way it works. Alcohol doesn't change. That's just the way the chemical works.
Yeah. This reminds me of one thing that really kind of hit me during the alcohol experiment when I was listening to y'all talk about cortisol, because I have a lot of clients where it's like, we'll look at we'll do like continuous glucose monitor. So we're going to look at their blood sugar for like 10 days straight on a constant feed. And I'll have a lot of these clients where it's like, your diet's really healthy, you're eating really well, you're exercising, but you have this high blood sugar that's not even related to really your food. It's like at night. And what I found is that that pattern that I see so often is coupled with like an oddly elevated like amount of cortisol. So if they went to like a doctor and got tested, their cortisol level wouldn't necessarily flag high for like a super dangerous thing like Cushing's disease, but overall their cortisol is higher compared to typical. And then sure enough, what I found is like I'll see that more often and more severely the more someone drinks alcohol, even though they're drinking maybe within what our society would say is like a normal amount of drinking. I'm seeing it cause problems with blood sugar. And I'm curious if you've like ever seen or heard of like that phenomenon or not.
Yeah, well, we know that that alcohol does have an impact on blood sugar, and one of the ways it has it is because so we have to understand that alcohol in itself is not toxic until we ingest it. And when we ingest it, so we can say, well, alcohol is a toxin, but the more honest way to approach it is that alcohol becomes toxic when we drink it. And so what happens is it turns into something called acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde is what we also find in cigarettes. And so it's super, super harmful. And so your body, which is amazing and resourceful, says, let's metabolize that really quickly and get rid of it. So what happens is we slow digestion. And so we've just interrupted blood sugar, because what does blood sugar do? Blood sugar is a part of digestion, that blood sugar regulation, that mechanism when we eat. We're going to have a little bit of spike, maybe a big spike, depending upon what we eat. Mm-hmm. And when we stop digestion cold, in order to prioritize metabolizing alcohol, we've taken the liver offline, we have disrupted blood sugar regulation. And so we've created this dynamic that is hard to get out of. And so all of the resources we have in the body trying to regulate blood sugar, now they're kind of offline. They've taken a back seat to metabolizing the alcohol. And we see a lot of impact from that around blood sugar. And then we also see this other interesting correlation with blood sugar is that when our blood sugar is low, we get more cravings. So one of the keys nutritionally to help people when they are in early days, drinking less alcohol, cutting back, doing an alcohol experiment, taking a break, eating more protein, and really prioritizing keeping your blood sugar regulated is a big key to not having as many cravings.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's super important. And I'm kind of on it now I'm kind of doing an experiment, and now I'm curious to see if someone has that sort of chronically elevated cortisol from chronic alcohol consumption, how long does it really take for that to drop down back to normal, and what are the blood sugar ramifications of that? So we're kind of doing some testing around that. But what kind of blew me away there is it's like I think even as nutritionists, you tend to focus on like just the food and maybe the exercise, and kind of it's almost like a societal thing that like, oh, and then like, okay, she has a glass or two of wine at night, like leave that alone. It's like, we're going to work around that and just kind of figure out how to get your blood sugar to the healthy levels in the context of that wine, almost like it's taboo to even address that. But I think from what, I think I've kind of come to a different place now where it's like, I don't think that is realistic, or even like that it serves the person to buy into what I think is really a societal like paradigm that we should just like kind of turn the other way on that and ignore that it's even a potential issue. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We're starting to see some new studies and some new guidelines come out. You and I were chatting that Canada just released new guidelines this week, based on part of their own studies, and then the World Health Organization, that no amount of alcohol is safe. Yeah. So when we think about guidelines, because we're both in the United States, the predominant guidelines that have been around for a long time in the US are 1 drink, and this is fascinating too, 1 drink a day for women, 2 drinks a day for men. That's considered safe or within the guidelines, right? Yeah. And just an aside here before I talk about the Canadian guidelines. So what was fascinating to me when I was looking at this is that you will see for women, so that's 7 drinks a week, right? But then the next guideline is 8 drinks a week is like dangerous. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Yeah. How do we get from 1 more drink? How about we start with like 1 or 2 drinks and then we say 8 is dangerous? How did we come right up to the danger zone and we made that okay? Yeah.
Are you sure 7's not a problem like at all? And
yeah,
8's exactly. Really bad.
Yeah. So the news that's really hitting now, and a lot of people are saying, well, wait a minute, what's happening, is that no amount of alcohol is safe. And Canada's actually come out with guidelines that say 1 to 2 drinks per week. And that is a huge step back from what was the 7 or 14 for men. And so we look at what they're saying, there's doesn't seem to be as much risk, or there is a significantly lower risk of health implications with 1 to 2 drinks. But again, the now new guidelines that are coming out, no amount of alcohol is safe. And that's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. And guidelines are fascinating. Like, I know that I was listening to a podcast recently about sobriety that's from like a researcher in the UK, and he was talking about their guidelines as like overall being where it allows quite a bit more than the US guidelines, which, having lived there, I'm like, well, that makes sense because they drank a lot. And so they probably would like, they're probably afraid to put out some guidelines that are more restrictive. But one thing I thought was interesting too is they said they have the same levels for male and female, because even though men are larger, they're like more dangerous when they drink. So there's actually like more health risk for them in terms of their behavior when they drink. So I think that's one thing we need to think about with guidelines is like, yeah, it's based on science, but then it's a consensus among these like experts in light of like the societal like things around them and what really they can negotiate. I think that they feel like they can kind of get away with the government like putting their stamp on. And so I don't know that you can just blindly trust. And then like another thing I think on that is like 7 drinks a day for women. I want to hear about
A week.
this. A week.
Yeah.
My thought on that is like, good luck drinking 7 drinks a week. If you're drinking 7 times a week, you're going to slow creep to 9, 12, 15, 20. You're not going to stay at 7. It doesn't work that way for most people. There might be some like fluke people that can pull that off, but I just don't think that most people can. But what do you think?
Oh, yeah. Well, alcohol builds a tolerance. So we know that. And I remember one of my very first alcohol-free clients, she called herself 2-Drink Kelly. And she said, people made fun of me because at 2 drinks, I was like inebriated. And, they would laugh and they'd say, oh, don't give Kelly more than 2 drinks. And she said, and then I became 3 and 4-Drink Kelly.
Yeah.
And she noticed and she thought, wait a minute, something has changed. And that goes back to the way that alcohol, so because we get this dopamine response and then we turn off some of those dopamine receptors, now it's taking more to get that same response. So we are building that tolerance, which is fascinating. The other thing about the new guidelines is this, we have doctors and even wellness and nutritionists, wellness professionals, nutritionists who say like, it's fine, red wine is heart healthy. And so we really have to start looking at that conversation and asking, is that true? So many people that I work with in this space say, well, I went to my doctor and I said, yeah, I have a couple of glasses of wine. And they're like, yeah, so does everybody. So do I. That's not the problem, and so we just sort of dismiss it outright. And I think it's really interesting. And I had this coaching conversation with a small group, and 2, there was a doctor and there was I think a CNA in the group. And so we were talking about what happens when people say, they ask the question, do you drink alcohol? And we say, oh yeah, I have a glass of wine now and then, or, I have a glass of wine at night. Mm-hmm. Usually I have a glass or 2 glasses of wine. One of them said we were taught to double it. And the other one said we were taught to triple the amount they're reporting.
I know. Well, my husband and like most of their friends are doctors. And so they are taught that. But what's crazy is like they double or triple it in their minds and then they do say nothing. They don't know what to say.
Exactly.
It's not really, unless you know about the work that you are doing in the Naked Mind, there's not a very good answer to the type of drinking that most people are doing. There's the Alcoholics Anonymous. If you are just, I think most people's impression of that is like your life is falling apart, like you are a hot mess, like disaster zone. And then there's like 99% of people that are just in this space where it's not serving them. They're losing their joy. They're tied to this, they're wasting time, they're wasting ambition, and they're increasing their health risk. But there's no, they're not going to go to an AA meeting. It doesn't really match who they are or where they're at. So like, I think that that's like a huge part of this problem, is that there's not enough knowledge around what to do about that. And there's also, like, to your point, not enough knowledge that of how bad alcohol is for us. And I love the way that, like, in the alcohol experiment, you just decimate the idea that alcohol is good for your heart. It isn't. Red wine is not good for your heart.
Yeah.
Maybe you can even talk about some of the other, like in terms of the alcohol guidelines, and they're saying no amount is safe. Like, what are some of the specific, like, health conditions that they're talking about with respect to, like, alcohol and risk?
Yeah, I think one of the probably the most astounding to me is the relationship to cancer, and particularly breast cancer. Like, we can
Mhm.
draw a definitive connection. And what they are saying is that, let's see, 1 to 3 drinks a week can increase your risk of breast cancer by up to 15%.
Mhm.
Like, that's just wow. That's just like, wow. If I was to say, oh, I don't want to get breast cancer, well, what is one of the main things you can do to decrease your risk? Giving up wine. But then here's the really interesting cultural connection here, and where our society is still really challenged to have these honest conversations. Because if we come to October, which is breast cancer awareness month, you will see wineries putting pink ribbons on their bottles
Yeah.
in support of breast cancer. You will see football stadiums having breast cancer awareness. Players will wear pink, but yet they sell alcohol at the event. They don't have an alcohol-free day in
No.
support at the event in
No.
support of breast cancer awareness. And so we hear this statistic and it sounds like, well, wait a minute. And then we look around and we say, well, if that was really true and that was really happening, wouldn't there be a bigger response? And so I think sometimes we are challenged to really accept these types of things that we can see scientifically what's going on. So breast cancer, we have liver cancer, colon cancer, mouth cancer, esophagus cancer. Those are the main ones that we see with a direct link to alcohol consumption. And then we have alcohol affects every system in our body. So we see the impact on gut health. We see the impact on our hormones. We see the impact on our immune system. And it was really fascinating to me, being in this space, that we didn't have culturally a bigger response to COVID and alcohol. I mean, one of the things they did I think it was in Canada, they changed the guidelines to make sure people could still get alcohol delivered during COVID when they were in isolation. And it
Mhm.
was like, if we are trying to boost people's immune response, we need to take alcohol out of the equation. So we just haven't had enough honest conversations about the impacts.
Yeah, exactly. I think I like how you bring up immune function, and then, like, let's talk about gut health specifically. What do you know about the research on alcohol and how it impacts gut health?
Yeah. So one of the biggest impacts is it slows digestion. And we know, as being in the nutritional field, that when we slow digestion, when food hangs around in our stomach and doesn't digest at the rate that it is supposed to, we have primary responses and then we have those secondary responses. So primarily, we're going to see um, acid indigestion, acid reflux, and then we're going to see the potential for intestinal permeability. So leaky gut. The longer the food hangs around undigested in your stomach, the more likely it's going to permeate and get into the bloodstream. And then we're going to have that immune response. We also have inflammation of the lining of the gut. And then we see the impact on the gut microbiome. So you introduce a toxin into the microbiome, you see that bad bugs have the upper hand now. And so all of those things make a direct impact on our gut health.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's it's really fascinating to me that that's not talked about more, just
Yeah.
because I guess it's like that. That's like the common thread in this, is that I'll have a lot of clients where they want to work on gut health, they've got digestive issues, they're doing they're up for doing like this special low FODMAP, SIBO, SCD gaps, whatever the diet is,
Yeah.
they're fine. But drinking alcohol is kind of like this non-negotiable thing.
Mm.
Um, but then again, just getting back to what we talked about, there's a actual like brain chemistry thing going on with the addictive properties of alcohol. And so I think that's really just such a challenge, both with respect to how it's so hard to stop wanting alcohol if you don't have support with that, and also just that our culture doesn't even like really openly suggest that it's even an issue.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I love that, we now have things like Dry January, and we see things like the alcohol experiment, where we really are starting to pay more attention to just getting curious. And that's one of the ways that I work with clients too, is we really start with curiosity, like, let's just explore what it looks like. How do you feel when you drink less? How do you feel? What happens when you try to take a break? What are the reasons you're using alcohol for? And one of the things that, and you probably, this might have stuck out for you going through the alcohol experiment, but we find that when we're drinking due to those unmet needs, our
Mhm.
alcohol consumption increases more. So I like to say it like, when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Mhm.
And so when we're using alcohol because we're bored, we're stressed, we're lonely, we are uncomfortable, we had a bad day at work, all these things. The more that we're using alcohol for all of those things, the
Yeah.
more space alcohol takes up in our head. And
Yeah.
so, while we do have this chemical part, we also get to pay attention to the habit piece and our thoughts around why we're using alcohol.
Mhm.
So, really, it's kind of like with food. I'm sure you do this with your clients, Erin, is that we look at the behavior, and I mentioned behavior comes last. So if you find yourself in the kitchen, like eating something, your head's in the fridge, we have to back it up and say, wait a minute, what just happened here? Why
Mhm.
is my head in the refrigerator? Am I
Yeah.
actually hungry? And
Yeah.
then we get to say, oh, no behavior happens without a thought and an emotion. So
Mhm.
what's happening here? Oh, I'm actually really sad. I've got this big thing weighing on my mind. I'm feeling really sad. And my brain said food would help. So it's the same thing with alcohol. We have to really say, like, what are the thoughts and emotions behind the behavior of having that glass of wine every night, or having
Mhm.
that third glass of wine, or using alcohol for any time we feel uncomfortable. And so, it's fascinating because we get to approach this from that physical place. What can we do to support taking a break physically and nutritionally? What can we do as far as exploring other tools that help? Things like meditation, things like tapping, things like mindfulness, grounding, all of these things come together in this place where we break up with alcohol. And it's really exciting to be able to approach, we kind of have a multifaceted approach.
Yeah, this is such a delicate thing because I like how like an alcohol experiment, I think that's where I was seeing it. You were talking about like there's definitely been this sort of like mom culture thing that's happened where it's like, oh, you're a mom, you must be so stressed out with your kids, and like especially during COVID, like wine is the answer to that. And I like how I think it was in there that you were even talking about like that the alcohol industry is like definitely like fed into that and like and pays for advertising to kind of like promote that type of thinking. And so I like how you kind of reframe it in the alcohol experiment of like actually when you I think it was Coach Scott that said this, like when you have a feeling like a stress or anxiety, then say like your kids are stressing you out in that example, and you say, okay, then I need a glass of wine, you're really kind of in your mind telling yourself that like you're weak and you can't handle that and you need to have this sort of like crutch. And then if you keep doing that, it's like you start to get into this mindset that you're weak, and that doesn't like serve you well because you actually aren't weak. Like you can do it. And there might be something you're masking that you need help with. So I think that is great. I just kind of think it's hard on like in this example of like women who are really stressed out and busy with kids. It's a different time with, I mean, in our generation, it's hard. We work generally full-time jobs. Our childcare is expensive. COVID was like the most stressful nightmare ever of like homeschooling your kids while you're working full time. They've got more sports and activities than ever. They're supposed to look and perform better than ever. It's extremely stressful. And so I think it's kind of still hard for me to have like the right language for moms around that of like, what, you think you're going to come at me now when I'm doing all this and you're going to take my glass of wine? Like, get out of here. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what do you say to that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, two things. First of all, just to, drive home that point, Erin, is that we can trace back the increase of women drinking to the mommy wine culture.
Yeah.
And then we see in COVID that women's alcohol consumption increased more than men, because just exactly what you're saying, the messaging was like, oh my gosh, now I'm working from home. My kids are here. I'm supposed to keep them. I'm the school teacher and the breadwinner, and I can't handle this. And therefore, I'm going to get on my Zoom with my friends. We're going to have happy hour and we're going to drink. And oh, yeah, wine is the answer to every question. So I think that we get to ask a different question. And that's where we can really say, I understand that, yeah, it does feel good to have a glass of wine at the end of the night. There is no doubt that we do get a chemical rush of endorphins. We get a chemical rush of dopamine. And there is that initial boost of pleasure. But we have to ask ourselves, just like with anything when it comes to our wellness, is there a cost? And is the cost greater than I'm maybe recognizing? Can I explore the cost? And what if I could have that rush of pleasure at the end of the evening? What if I could have peace? What if I could have a different dynamic and it didn't involve alcohol? Is that something I'm willing to explore? And so I like to think with my clients, I usually don't work on nutrition until they've had some time alcohol free, because they're going to learn a lot of the same techniques around letting go of alcohol that they might in changing their diet. There's a lot of habit hacks. There's a lot of, framework that we can, cross over. And so I really like to ask them, what is it you're looking for? Like, how do you see your evening going? And one of the things that's really interesting with moms is that often picking up that glass of wine is like the sign, like, I'm off duty. Like, no more. It's my time now. It's me time. Enough. It's like
Sure.
The taxi is driving down the street and they took their light off and said,
Yeah.
no longer on duty. And so we need to explore what is another option for mommy me time that doesn't involve alcohol. What would that look like? And does that feel better for me?
Yeah. Yeah. What can be another form of self-care? I mean, it's tough to find that time, I think, for women, but to your point, are you really it takes time from you when you drink.
Oh yeah. So, give up drinking and you'll have lots of hours to do something more productive, for sure. And then, I was just on a call with coaching two women who are good friends. And so we're doing sort of a one-on-one coaching, but there's two of them, which is really fun. And one of them has a newborn and then like a 4-year-old, and one of them has like a 9 and 11-year-old. So they are right in that mommy place where you're talking about, where there's just a lot. And, what they're identifying is that they're really missing the connection. They're just not present. They're more irritated. They're not showing up the way they want to. And so when we start to explore and ask those questions, I think we can just say, gosh, this mommy wine culture, yeah, it's out there, but is it serving me? Do I want to be a part of that? Is drinking every night helping me show up as the best mom I want to be?
Totally. I definitely noticed that without alcohol, I'm at night with my kids, I'm less snappy, I'm more patient, I'm more present at bedtime. And so it definitely, I think, serves our family better if I'm not. And I think that's just like a reframe of like, okay, if I have so much stress on me that I'm not managing that stress well, then I need to solve that problem instead of masking that problem. Because it's like once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. Like once you realize how chemically addictive alcohol is, how much it increases your risk of chronic conditions like heart disease and cancer, and how much in the short term it impacts your hormones and how much it impacts your gut, and your blood sugar. You can't look at it in the same way as this. I think our society kind of looks at it as this like free pass of like, well, why not just make yourself feel better with a drink or two, because it's harmless as long as you're within your 7-ish drinks a night, which like
7-ish,
you're not
yeah.
really tracking, because you kind of like have like one turn into three, and like if you're really counting the ounces, and even if you have 2 glasses of wine, you probably had three. So yeah, I think it's like that's the thing, is like starting with like what you said of like knowledge instead of behavior, and then the behavior follows, because when you understand those things about alcohol, you have different desires around it. And even if you still feel addicted, fair enough, it's addicting, but there's ways to get help with that don't mean you have to like show up in a AA meeting. Not that there's anything wrong with AA. I just think that there's a lot of people that are living in that, most people are living, I think, in that gray zone where it's like they don't feel like they're to the AA point, but they're definitely above the point where like it's harmless. So there's just so much need for what you guys do. It's so important.
Yeah, there's that beautiful line that says, the question is not, am I drinking too much? The question is, would my life be better with less?
Right. Yeah, it's a good point. Well, Teri, I know I could chat with you all day. I'm obsessed with this topic, but I know I have to let you go. So maybe I'm sure like a lot of people are probably hearing this kind of information for the first time. I think this is the first alcohol podcast I've made. So maybe if people are interested in connecting with you and learning more, do you mind sharing some details about where they can find you?
Sure, yeah. So my business is The Sober Nutritionist, and I do coach in the Annie Grace programs. I coach in the year-long PATH program. I coach in the alcohol experiment. And so those are available as well. You can do the live version of the alcohol experiment a few times a year. It's available, or you can do what Erin, you mentioned, that is the free version, which I highly encourage you just get more information if you're at all curious. And then I also am on Instagram at Teri.thesobernutritionist, and I have a podcast called The Sober Edge, which is about inspiration for living alcohol-free.
Loving that. I can't wait to check out your podcast. I listened to you on another person's podcast, so I'm going to listen to yours as well.
Great.
And then I know you have a free handout, 5 healthy reasons to take a break from alcohol. Can people find that at your website?
Yes, absolutely. And it's the first thing that pops up. And it really is just about getting a little bit more practical information about the impacts of alcohol and making a healthy choice from there.
I love that. I think that's my favorite thing about the alcohol experiment is it's not condescending. It's not performance based. It gives you the respect that you deserve to make your own decisions. It doesn't superimpose on you what you should do. It honors your reasoning of, hey, look, society is not equipping you with truthful information of alcohol. Here's the true situation with alcohol. Here's some things to ponder about alcohol, and then decide whatever you want to do. It's up to you. So I really love that approach. I think it resonates with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think over 500,000 people have now taken the alcohol experiment. So yeah, it's resonating with a lot of people. So it's really fabulous that we have alternatives to explore.
Yeah, I'll leave you on this though, which I don't know if you agree with this, but I just turned 40, and so did like somebody that works with me, and we both are kind of similar in our like, man, we really like are not loving where alcohol's come in our life. And I was saying to her, I said, you know what? I used to, when I was younger, I felt like alcohol, I think part of like what originally started for me and for a lot of people is like, it made me feel more accepted. It made me feel more acceptable. It made me socially have an easier time to like make friends and fit in. And that was a big part of my drive with alcohol. But now it kind of feels like there's almost this like sober movement among people that are younger than me. And it's like, oh, it kind of makes me feel like, oh, it's like an old person thing that you have like this thing with a glass of wine, kind of like if you were cool, you wouldn't be stuck on your glass of wine. I'm like, dang, we need to like get it together. It's not even cool anymore. Yeah. Now's the time to like let go of this.
Well, one of the most fascinating things, and we talk all the time in the sober community about the writing is on the wall that at some point it's going to look like, we're going to have the same perspective that we do with cigarettes.
Yeah.
where, gosh, doctors used to say, oh, it's good for you. It'll calm you down. Oh, I prescribe that you have, I had a client who said, oh, my doctor told me to have a couple glasses of wine for my anxiety. And it's like, yeah, well, they
Wow.
used to do that with cigarettes too. And
Wow.
so I think we really are seeing where cigarettes are no longer cool. In fact, you're almost like the pariah if you smoke. And so we're not there with alcohol yet, but we are
No.
moving in that direction where people are starting to say, like, do I really want to give all my power over to this substance in a glass? Or do I want to have fun on my own terms and redefine what being present looks like and
Yeah.
socializing looks like? So it's very exciting.
Yeah, I think so too. It's hard for me to imagine it going the way of cigarettes, but I'm sure that people would have said that about cigarettes
Yeah.
before that happened. So there's hope.
Yes, yes. And I really think that, for you and I, for our perspective, true wellness is wellness without wine because we do have a toxic substance, and just acknowledging that, like, when we're really talking wellness, let's get really clear about the impact that alcohol has and just ask, is this the level of wellness I'm willing to settle for, or can I do more? Do I want more?
Yeah, it's funny when you have an alcohol habit because even hearing you say that in my where I'm at in my journey, it's like it sounds scary because
Mhm.
it's like I think if you don't know how to get into a space where you crave alcohol less, you don't know how to live without alcohol. It's a scary idea. And so I think it's just, yeah, wellness is redefining your feelings around alcohol and just kind of maybe the thing to understand is like it is possible to do that where you can get to a point where it's not scary to imagine and it's a process. And so like you guys offer a great a number of resources where people can engage in that process. And so the expectation is not that you just say, oh, I want to be healthy, therefore I need to like white knuckle and stop drinking alcohol despite how much I love it and it's going to be this hard nightmare thing forever. It's really can be that it's like small and insignificant in your life and that it's not hard. So that's like hopefully an encouraging note on
Yeah, and
that.
I love your honesty about this, Erin, because it really is, I was there too. I was in this place where I thought that it was gonna, ruin my life.
Yeah.
Like, how am I gonna show up and where am I gonna show up? And are people gonna accept me? And will I be boring? Will they be boring? How am I gonna fit in? How am I even gonna get through one day?
Hmm.
And so it's so refreshing to just have an honest conversation around, like, this is where we start. But I'm here to tell you that I have worked and walked along besides, thousands of people in these big groups with this naked mind. And it's not only possible, but it's absolutely astounding. People will say, I was going along and I was learning the science, and I was trying the things, and I was creating new rituals and new habits and new tools. And all of a sudden it was like a magic trick. It's like,
Yeah.
I no longer desire alcohol. And it's
Yeah.
really powerful. And the
It is.
beautiful thing about it is that we can remove alcohol if we want to 100% from our life. We can start, we can feel really liberated from it. We don't have to stay fixated on it. We don't have to do one day at a time. We don't have to be tied to meetings for the rest of our life. We can actually be empowered by moving into a new presence. And it's available and it's worth exploring.
Absolutely. Terry, you're such a joy. I really want to thank you for the time you spent today on our podcast. And we'll definitely put all your links in our show notes so that people can connect with you and just jump on to getting some more support.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed meeting you, Erin. Thanks so much for having me.
You as well. Take care and we'll talk to you soon.